All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Nutritious Bites. My name is Whitney Bignell. I'm a registered dietitian nutritionist up in Tennessee, but am, as I say every time, from Georgia, lived most of my life in Georgia. So very happy to be talking to you today. I am recording this session, so if you don't have a chance to join live today, I am recording and we'll upload that to YouTube and post on the Facebook page if you want to go back and review. So I'm trying a different program today. Hopefully it's going to work out okay. I'm going to try to get my cursor over there to see if that will change. So today we're going to talk about low carb diets. They obviously continue to be very popular, and you hear about them in the news all the time. If it's as a low carb diet, as ketogenic diet, as paleo diet, you get lots of information about low carb being so helpful for weight loss and controlling diabetes and those kind of things. So we're going to talk a little bit today about what are carbohydrates. And also, when we're talking about a low carbohydrate diet or a ketogenic diet, what does that mean specifically? And, to go ahead and give you a preview of that, the answer is complicated because everybody defines it a different way. And then we're going to look at a little bit of what the research says about the effects of low carb eating plans on weight loss and diabetes control, and some things that you really have to think about if you do want to try a low carb diet or if you are currently on a low carb diet. And then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for some Q&A. So I'm just going to have my email open on the side in case anyone's having difficulties joining, and those kind of things. All right, so let's get started. So this is probably a refresher for most of you, but just, thinking about what exactly are carbohydrates, the things that we are being told we should limit in our diets by a lot of folks. Most of the time you think about your breads, your cakes, your pastries, your donuts, muffins this time of year, and all those kind of things. And I do apologize that my email is dinging in the background. Hopefully it will not make too many more dings. But carbohydrates, they really are found in a variety of foods. And I mostly want to point out they're found in a variety of our healthy foods, the foods that we typically encourage you to eat frequently, such as our whole grains, our fruits, our vegetables, dairy products have carbohydrates in them, beans, legumes, all of those things, those are also sources of carbohydrates. And the big thing about carbs is that they are our source of glucose, which is the fuel for the body. Our body uses glucose to turn it into ATP or energy, and that is what fuels all of the processes in our bodies. So we really do need sources of fuel. Yes, our body can make glucose from proteins. It can make glucose from fats. It's just not quite as efficient at doing so. And then if we don't have enough carbohydrates in our diet, aka the ketogenic diet, then our body starts to use break down fats to ketones and use ketones for fuel, which it can do. But once again, it's just not as efficient as using glucose. And I don't mean to put that spin on this up front, because I do want to present some of the evidence as far as are low carbs beneficial for weight loss and diabetes and those kind of things. So we're going to get to that. But I am going to give you that nutritionist perspective up front of why some carbohydrates are necessary for our health. You do want to think about the simple versus the complex carbohydrates. And of course, we always talk more about having more complex carbohydrates in your diet. I have a slide. The next slide is going to talk a little bit more about the complex carbohydrates. And so, we'll kind of go through that in just a moment. But simple carbohydrates, those are the usually the two molecule uh, compounds that we think about. So that is like fructose, which has the glucose model and the fructose model. We have lactose. So those are also two sugar molecules, and they break down very easily. And then we have those that are pure glucose that break down very easily. They're absorbed rapidly into our system. And yes, those are the compounds that can spike our blood sugar a little more quickly. And that we want to be sure that we are combining those sugar foods with other foods like healthy fats and proteins and fiber rich foods, because that's going to slow absorption of the glucose into bloodstream and prevent those sugar spikes that we see. The other thing to think about, though, is that these carbohydrate foods that we typically recommend, our whole grains, our fruits, our vegetables, they also provide more than just energy. They provide lots of vitamins, minerals, and are a great source of fiber in the diet, which we know fiber is important to control blood sugars. It's important to help lower your cholesterol, and it's important to help make you regular. So that's, why we say you do need some carbohydrates in your eating plan to maintain your health overall. Now, I want to just kind of point out that the current recommendations from the DRIs, the dietary recommended intakes, and from the dietary guidelines for Americans is that we should have about 45 to 65% of our calories be carbohydrates. And that's a pretty wide range. And you probably have heard me say before that if you do have concerns about your blood sugars, you would want to stay on the lower end of that range. If you are a little more active and you need more energy, you would be on the upper end of the range. And that's going to be important when we talk about what is low carbohydrate in just a few minutes. So I want to just kind of point out our complex carbohydrates. So as you would imagine, if we talk about simple sugars being two molecules together, complex carbohydrates are much longer chains of glucose that often are part of, we call them starches. And oftentimes, these complex carbohydrates are also in combination with the fibers. So think about your whole grain breads and cereals, your legumes, your rice, especially whole grain rice like brown rice or whole wheat pasta, and all of our starchy vegetables. Yes, it's sugar, but, and we have to account for it if we have diabetes, but they take longer to break down. They do have fiber that come with the package. And so it's a healthier option than, yes, having, a lot of breads and, a lot of cakes and cookies and those kind of things that have, the added sugars, more simple sugars, or something like even fruit juice where you don't have the benefit of the fiber most of the time. So these are healthy things to eat. Yes, a bit in moderation. We don't want to go overboard and have 5 or 6 cups of rice per day, but this is part of a healthy eating plan. So when we talk about low carbohydrate, this is where it gets interesting. It really varies as far as how researchers are going to define low carbohydrate and how the ketogenic diet defines low carbohydrate, how Atkins diet defines low carb. So typically with plans like the Atkins diet, where you have a kind of staged approach to limiting your carbohydrates. In the first phase, that's going to be the most restrictive, they are limiting you to 20 to 30 grams per day of carbohydrates, or less than 20% of your total energy or calories. So if you remember from the previous 2 slides back, the recommended intake is 45 to 65% of calories. And if you have these, standard 2,000 calorie per day diet, which is, yes, that's not what everybody needs, but that's the basis for all of our food labels. That equates to about 900 to 1,300 calories per day from carbohydrates. And that's more around 200 to 250-ish grams of carbohydrate per day. That's the recommendation. So if you think about going from 200 to 250 grams per day down to 20 to 30, that's quite a decrease. And a lot of times studies that are included in this literature, they may have carbohydrate intake up to 40 to 45% of total energy, and that's very close to our recommendations. So that's where it gets tricky, trying to figure out what is low carb when we are talking low carb. But I will say that most people who ask about these diets or have been told by a healthcare provider to follow a low carb plan, typically they are advised to consume between 25 and 50 grams of carbohydrates per day. So what does that look like as far as food goes? This list just gives you some examples of the amount of carbohydrates that are in each of these foods. And if you have diabetes or know someone who has diabetes and you do carb counting, then you are very familiar with some of these numbers. So for example, a small apple, not the nice big ones that you get this time of year, but the small apples, that's what we consider one carbohydrate serving, or about 15 grams of carbohydrate. Even a small baked potato is 30 grams of carbohydrate. So if you are trying to follow that initial phase in Atkins and stay within 20 to 30 grams of carbohydrates, then one small baked potato a day, that's it. Everything else has to be a pretty much zero carbohydrate food at that point. A third of a cup of cooked brown rice, that's 15 grams of carbohydrates. So if you had 2/3 of a cup of brown rice, once again, that's your carbohydrates for the day, and you've got to switch to, zero carbohydrates at that point. Even something that is, considered healthy and considered more of a protein food, like plain fat-free Greek yogurt, it has some carbohydrates in there too, because it is a dairy product. So one of the figures that I found online for, about 2/3 of a cup of Greek yogurt, which is kind of like if you buy the little single servings, that's going to be 2/3 of a cup. That's 7 grams of carbohydrates. And then of course, if you have a special treat like red velvet cake, yes, it's got a lot of saturated fat in there as well with the icing and other things. But that's, 48 grams of carbohydrates right there. So it's not going to fit into phase 1 of the Atkins or keto diet at all. So this just kind of gives you a little perspective of if you were going to go low carbohydrate per how many of the diets recommend it, a lot of foods that you're probably eating right now, you would have to severely limit during that phase of going low carb. So what could you eat in a typical day on a low carb eating plan? This I pulled from an article on Everyday Health. Is just one example of a daily eating plan. Things like scrambled eggs, that's probably fine. You may already eat that in the morning, several days a week. And then, to get a little bit of fiber, not a whole lot, but a little bit could be, like on a bed of lettuce. And then avocados are often foods that are recommended with low carb eating plan. They do have healthy fats, and they do tend to be a little bit more satiating, which is great. You could snack on things like sunflower seeds. Your lunch might be a salad with non-starchy vegetables and grilled salmon, or perhaps a baked chicken or something like that. Once again, your snack might be celery and pepper strips with some guacamole. Once again, avocados, healthy fats. This is good. And then you might have, something like a pork chop, or once again, a baked or grilled chicken with, cauliflower mash, not potatoes, and red cabbage slaw. So overall, you can have healthy foods within a low carb eating plan. So it is a complete myth that all low carb eating is going to be super high in saturated fats, and those kind of things. That's not true. You can have a healthy eating plan with low carb eating, but I will say up front, it does take quite a bit of planning, and quite a bit of forethought, and sometimes a little bit of research to figure out, okay, so what are the non-starchy vegetables that I can include, and how can I add more flavor to what I'm doing to make it a little bit more enjoyable, and those kind of things. And, once again, hopefully you really like avocados if you're on the low carb eating plan, because that's one of the easiest way to incorporate something that's going to give you a creamy texture, have those healthy fats, and go with different things. All joking aside, people who follow low carb plan, in my opinion, typically wind up having limited variety in what they're doing, just because it takes so much research and planning to come up with your daily meal plan. I'm not saying that it can't be done, but it just takes a lot of planning and effort. And you kind of work out, okay, I know I can eat this, this, and this. And so that's what you typically wind up doing most days of the week if you're going to, follow this kind of plan. You can have variety, but it does take more work. So some of the benefits that we do see with low carbohydrate diets is that it can help with weight loss. Initially your body is going to deplete its glycogen stores, which is how our body stores carbohydrates. We don't have great mechanisms for storing carbs in the body. So glycogen is stored in the muscles, and then there's some reserves in the liver as well. And when we are not putting carbohydrates into the body, our body tends to burn through those glycogen stores pretty quickly. And at that point, the body starts to break down the fats for energy. And if we don't have carbs coming in, then it will switch to using those ketones for energy, aka ketosis or ketogenic diet. And yes, our brains can use ketones for fuel, but it's not the preferred fuel for our brains. We're just not as efficient at getting energy from ketones and those kind of things. So with all of this, when our body does go into the ketosis, we do have weight loss through loss of water at that point. So a lot of people get really excited, as when they start a ketogenic diet or a low carb diet, because they see that scale drop pretty quick in the first week or two. And yes, that's mostly water weight that's being lost at that point. And then the weight loss tends to slow afterwards. Now, outside of the water weight loss, we can see more loss of pounds with a low carb diet. And the mechanism for that is believed to be that having a diet that's higher in those fats and proteins may increase your satiety after meals, so you don't feel as hungry, or you can go longer before you feel hungry again. Our body does take longer to break down proteins and fats. They take longer to go through the GI tract. So we do stay full longer. And that's one of the things that we do see as a benefit of a lower carbohydrate diet. And some studies have shown that they can lower the risk of type 2 diabetes as well as cardiovascular disease. So we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes as well. So I want to just give you a couple of studies that speak to the impact of a low carb diet on weight loss, and then on glycemic control, or controlling your blood sugars if you do have diabetes. And I will say that in my searching for systematic reviews, and my first step was actually to go to what we call our evidence analysis library with the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which is where we as dietitians, if we want to know what are some things that we should be putting into practice, we go to the evidence analysis library and see if it's been, if a systematic review has been done around this topic. And so I went to the weight management section to see if they had done a study of different macronutrient distributions and, your balance of fats, carbohydrates, and protein, and how that impacts weight loss. And I know that there are other systematic reviews out there around that, but it was really hard to find one that was very recent. I guess we're kind of moving on to other things at this point. I'm not quite sure, or just the fact that the evidence is so mixed. I think that's why I had a little bit of trouble finding a good systematic review to share with you today. But I did come across this one that was from the British Journal of Nutrition back in 2016. And these researchers, Mansour et al., looked at the effect of low carbohydrate diets versus what we traditionally recommend for weight loss, those low fat diets, on body weight and cardiovascular risk factors. And so this is what we call a meta-analysis of randomized control trials. And this is where researchers will pull the data from several different studies to be able to see if there's an overall trend and effect of this type of intervention. This is kind of the highest level of evidence that we have to say if an intervention is effective or not, because if we look at just one randomized control trial, that's really not going to tell us a whole lot. Those studies have to be replicated and see if you get the same results in different groups of people, because it may be that just this one group of people saw an effect for any variety of reasons. So to have a recommendation for practice, we need to see that this is consistent across many different studies. And that's what a meta-analysis does for us. So the table that you're seeing here is just a summary of the different studies that are included in this meta-analysis. So the researchers were looking for interventions that defined carbohydrate intake as being less than 20% of calories per day, if I remember correctly, and that the outcomes they were looking for was change in body weight, or cardiovascular risk factors, or glycemic control, or other indications of diabetes or prediabetes. And so and that they were comparing that diet to a low fat diet. So that's kind of the key. It wasn't just a low carb diet, but that their essentially control diet was a low fat diet. So you can see a few things here. You can see the country where these studies were conducted, and most of them were in the US. You can see how long the study was, and that includes follow-up periods too. So the actual intervention in following the diet may have been 3 months, it may have been 6 months, it may have been, 12 months, and then they have a follow-up period. So that's what you see as the duration of the intervention as far as total months go. Then you will see how each of the studies defined a low carbohydrate diet and a low fat diet, whether or not they had a set energy goal for people to meet. And that's, to say, are they trying to make sure everybody is losing weight by having a restricted calorie diet? Or are they seeing if it's purely the diet composition that might change appetite and therefore lead to weight loss and things like that? The interesting thing to note is that far right column, though, is the dropout rate. What percent of participants in each of those groups dropped out before the end of the trial? And you can see that for both, there's a relatively high dropout rate, as you would expect, but I don't think it looks like there was a higher dropout rate with the low carb group than the low fat group. But just note that there is still a pretty decent dropout rate for both interventions in pretty much all of the studies. So as far as, and for this systematic review, I'm only going to show you the results for the weight loss because that's what I wanted to focus on. What you will see here is a graph that shows the confidence intervals for if there was a difference in weight loss between the low carb group and the low fat group. And what you're looking for is anything that is to the left of this 0 line, anything where the confidence interval is completely to the left is showing that the low carb group did have a more significant change in their weight compared to the low fat group for that study. So if it crosses this 0, then there's no significant effect. If it's to the right, then it would favor the low fat group. And what you can see is that while some of the studies, like the one here, here, and here, while they do cross that confidence interval, you do have a number of studies that are to the left. And so that is what the systematic review revealed, is that there did seem to be benefit towards weight loss of a low carb diet over a low fat diet. However, a lot of the limitations of the studies, as you can imagine, is that sometimes it's self-reported data as far as adherence to the dietary pattern goes. And we also don't have enough follow-up long-term to see if those changes in weight are maintained across, a year, 2 years, 3 years out. So while we do see it within the intervention, we still don't know what the long-term effect on weight loss is. But at least in the short term, it does look like a low carbohydrate diet can be more effective than a low fat diet in helping people to lose weight. And then, kind of my caveat is sometimes it is helpful to have that kind of quick win with weight loss to increase your motivation. But then you have to figure out how do you sustain those changes over time. And that's the real trick to this, I think. And then I didn't come across a good systematic review about the effect of low carb diets on glycemic control. There probably is one out there. I don't know how it is. I didn't come across it. But this is a fairly recent randomized control trial that came out, and I think there was a lot of press around it. And the effect of a calorie unrestricted, low carbohydrate, high fat diet, dietary pattern on type 2 diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And so with this trial, they did see a significant decrease in, so the trial was 6 months long, and then they had a 3-month follow-up afterwards, if I remember correctly. And they did see that there was a significant decrease in hemoglobin A1C for people who followed the low carb, higher fat diet. They were, given free rein to eat as much as they wanted, to satiety and those kind of things. And with the groups, they did lose weight. There was no effect between the two groups on non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, but there was some effect on glycemic control. However, it was not maintained at that 3-month follow-up period. So once again, I think that some of these eating plans, low carb diet, can get you started on making changes, but you then have to figure out, how do you maintain it over time? So some of the potential side effects of low carb diets, kind of based on what we discussed at the beginning, the fact that you're eliminating or severely limiting fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, a lot of foods that we encourage eating for different health conditions, those fiber-rich foods. So when people switch to a low carb diet, they typically will have what's called keto flu. You probably have heard about that. So they may suffer from things like constipation, they may get headaches, they may get muscle cramps. And I think a lot of this is, part of that metabolic shift in your body of going from using glucose for fuel to switching to breaking down fats and using ketones for fuel. Our bodies can do it, just doesn't do it as efficiently. And, these are some of the side effects that we see. Also, the fact that you're missing a lot of vitamins and minerals from your diet by avoiding these foods, things like vitamin C, magnesium, some potassium, and things like that. And I think that can play into giving people headaches and muscle cramps and those kind of things. It's also really difficult for most people to maintain a low carb diet over the long haul. Um, as I mentioned at the beginning, most people kind of figure out, okay, here's what fits within this low carb eating plan. And so you kind of stick to doing basically the same thing day in and day out. It can get boring after a while. It's a little challenging to switch things up. You have to do quite a bit of research of how many carbs are in each of the new foods you're considering adding to your eating plan, and trying to get new recipes and things like that. Especially if you're trying to limit your saturated fat intake, so you're not using the bacon and all of those kind of things. You're trying to stay with lean proteins and healthy fats, and it's just a little bit complicated. And also think about when you're going out to eat with folks. It's very difficult to stay on plan when you're going out to eat. So you might, allow yourself to have a cheat day or a free day, or, a day I'm not following the plan. And that definitely, from my perspective, would be encouraged. But, then I think a lot of people fear, well, if I do that and I'm doing that once or twice a week, I feel like I'm going to get off plan and won't be able to get back on. And so that's scary for a lot of people. And, in many ways, that winds up leading to a decreased quality of life if you're so focused on your food that you're afraid to go out and have fun the usual way that you did. So it's really hard to maintain over the long term. And, the last thing that I like to point out is the fact that these studies, they're not really that long. They may be the longest studies that seem to have been identified that are, good studies are 12 to 24 months, so 1 to 2 years. Outside of that, we don't know what the long-term consequences are of eating low-carb plans. There aren't studies that look at this adequately. And a lot of the data, if we, look at epidemiological studies, it's self-reported. And so we don't have good measurements to say, yes, this person always had less than 20% of their energy from carbohydrates. And here are their, biomarkers at the end. Do they have lower LDL, or do they have increased LDL? Do they have lower triglycerides? All of those things we don't know because it's self-reported data if we're looking at a long cohort type study. So, that's the big thing is in the short term, we do see that there's some benefits to low carb eating on weight loss and also glycemic control. But we don't know if it can be maintained long term, and if it is, do we continue to see those benefits or not? We don't have any studies that can prove that yet, so more research is needed. However, if you do want to try low carb eating, perhaps you are trying to better manage your blood sugars and think that this might be helpful for you. And I have some students who have type 1 diabetes, which is a whole different ball game than type 2 diabetes. And they oftentimes will try to follow a much lower carbohydrate plan because they see that certain foods really spike their blood sugars. So, if you have type 2 diabetes or prediabetes, and you want to try to decrease your carbohydrates to see if that helps with blood sugar control, that can be a good thing. If you want to see if it helps with weight, if it helps you get started losing a few pounds, that may be a good thing as well. I will say that if you want to try ketogenic diet, Atkins diet, or any other version of low carbohydrate, you want to focus on those healthy sources of proteins and fats. So, some of the things you see on the internet about eating all the bacon that you want and, things with, and butter and, other sources of saturated fat, cream, heavy cream things. I think that's on the internet quite a bit. I would say focus on healthy sources of proteins and fats. You do want to include physical activity. That seems to really enhance the benefits of a low carb diet. Because physical activity has a positive effect on many of our cardiovascular risk factors as well as blood sugar control. You just would, if you have type 2 diabetes and you're on medication for type 2 diabetes, you have to be careful going low carb and really increasing physical activity because you do risk having more hypoglycemic episodes, so low blood sugar, which actually is a lot more dangerous than high blood sugars are. So you have to be really careful if that's the case. And if that's the case, I'm going to jump down to my point number 4, is that you want to work with your healthcare provider or a registered dietitian nutritionist if you have, specifically diabetes and are on medication, because you'll have to really figure out how to manage your medication dose if you're going to be cutting way back on your carbohydrates. And then back up to point number 3 is that you want to drink plenty of fluids. And because you're not eating a lot of fruits and vegetables, as much as you would if you were following, a regular, more balanced macronutrient plan, you're going to be missing out on some of those minerals that are electrolytes for us. So you want to drink plenty of fluids, and to stay hydrated, you may need to have things like Pedialyte or Gatorade or those kind of things that don't have sugar added, but electrolytes in there to help you better absorb the water and those kind of things. And that will also help with some of the symptoms of keto flu, and those kind of things. But it's important to stay hydrated anyway. So, all right. So, just some key takeaways from today is that, some research does indicate that low carb eating can help with weight loss, at least in the short term. So, anywhere from 6 months up to maybe 9 months or a year. But really and truly, after that 1 year mark, most of the studies don't see any difference between low carb plant eating plans and other forms of calorie restriction. Macronutrients don't make a difference at all. Reducing carbohydrates might improve your blood sugar control in type 2 diabetes or prediabetes. And that to a certain extent does make sense. However, you do once again have to be a little more careful, especially if you're on medication, that you don't risk becoming hypoglycemic. So if your dose of medication has been titrated for your usual carbohydrate intake, and all of a sudden you make a change, there is a real possibility that you can have a hypoglycemic episode, which is, not something that you want to do. So if you are going to go low carbohydrate, talk with your healthcare provider first, if that's the case. Once again, we don't have any studies that show us the long-term benefits from low carb diets. So in the short term, we can see benefits, but we don't know what that looks like, 5-10 years down the road. So we don't know if it would continue to be beneficial or not. And once again, it is super important, I can't stress this enough, to work with your healthcare professional if you're going to go on a low carb diet. Because there are just changes that happen in your body, especially if you have chronic conditions and if you're taking medications, that you want to be sure that you are staying safe with that. And also, if you need supplements, you want to work with your healthcare provider, because if you are, really limiting your fruits and vegetables, you're going to be low in vitamin C, which is important for wound healing, folic acid, magnesium, and a couple of other key nutrients. So you want to be sure that you get that from a supplement at the very least, and you'll want to work with your healthcare provider to be sure you've got the right thing on board. All right. And so that is kind of my take on low carb eating plans. Does anyone have any questions? Please feel free to put them in the chat. Or I'm going to try to get back over to my screen where I can see my chat and stop share. Or you can unmute. All right. Well, I don't think I see any questions, but if you do have any afterwards, or just want more information, please, please, please don't hesitate to send me an email, and I will be happy to respond to you and find resources for you and those kind of things. Well, I hope you guys have a great rest of October. And next month, we will be talking about flexitarianism, which is kind of a spin on vegetarian lifestyle right before Thanksgiving, of course. So I look forward to seeing you all then. Once again, hope you have a great rest of October and kind of start to the whole holiday season. And I'll see you in November. Have a wonderful rest of your day.